served as the forage and grassland agronomist for NRCS in Virginia since October 2008. He is the lead technical contact for NRCS in Virginia on agronomic aspects of conservation on grasslands, including forage establishment, grazing management, grassland, weed and brush control, and habitat conservation. JB excels at developing partnerships with agencies, non-government organizations, producer organizations, and farmers for using forage and grazing demonstrations along with hands-on teaching methods to emphasize how intentional management of grassland systems improves soil health and enhances system productivity. JB, if you are ready, we will turn the meeting over to you.
That sounds good, Kelly. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. As she said, we're going to be doing the next couple hours worth of training on the Pasture Condition Score assessment tool. Now, some of you are very familiar with this. Others tuning in today, you may be somewhat new conservationists, so this might be your first training on this tool. Many of you know this was updated and revised. The new revision was put out in January of 2020. And for some of you, this might be the first training that you've had on the revised document. So let's begin. All right, to start, just going to go over more of the learning objectives, what we're going to cover in this training today. It's going to be a very detailed instruction on the overall pasture condition score process, and this is an assessment tool. You're going to learn the purpose of conducting a pasture condition score. We're going to go over when and how to conduct the score. I'm going to review the documents that you need to have available when you go out to the field to do this assessment process. Then we'll dig in specifically on the 10 indicators for pasture condition, and we'll look at those very in depth today, take them one by one, and take some questions in the chat box and try to answer some of those questions at the end of each one of those indicators as we go along. During this time, if there's any terminology that's a little bit odd to you, I'll try to explain the terminology and how it relates to this specific tool. And at the end, we'll go over how to use the actual results of the PCS score. So let's dig in. They developed this pasture condition score. The first one that I saw was, I guess, a 2001 document. And we used that one up until last year. So basically, conservationists needed to have a systematic, repeatable approach on how to go about assessing a pasture. And with this, they developed a numerical scoring system, 1 to 50, to do the overall pasture score. And that's broken down into 10 different categories. But basically, we're going to use this, or we do use this detailed assessment tool to look very closely at a pasture. And as you're evaluating that pasture, you're identifying certain problems, such as poor plant growth, poor cover, the amount of invasive weeds that might be present. At the same time, you'll see the livestock there in the pasture, be able to do a quick visual assessment of them, just to look and see, are their feed and forage needs being met, or are they in poor body condition? Also, you'll look at any signs of erosion, visual soil loss, increased runoff potential to adjacent waters that might be impaired based on the management of the pasture that you're rating. Basically, the pasture condition score, it's a very, very thorough approach. We use it primarily to document and benchmark pasture condition, but it also indicates how well a pasture is being managed, that being from the time you start with the benchmark, and then each year thereafter, as you go back and visit and evaluate the pasture after improvements have been made. One other purpose for the PCS score is it helps you as a planner identify which changes are most likely to improve the pasture condition and the overall performance of the pasture system that you're evaluating. So a big question that I typically get from conservationists, and especially new conservationists, is when should I conduct the pasture condition score? The most important thing to remember is that it's intended to be used during the active growing season. And for most of Virginia, our growing season in pastures typically begins around the beginning of April and then would wind up around the beginning to the middle of November. But to be most useful, the pasture condition score could be conducted multiple times during that growing season. I want to emphasize here, whenever you begin working with a producer who is managing a forage and livestock system, and you're going to do an initial evaluation, a farm tour with that producer, I want you to be able to take this pasture condition score sheet and do that initial benchmark assessment. And we use this to kind of document what's the condition of the pasture before we start working with the producer, giving them recommendations in the conservation plan. Because once you do that and they start implementing those recommendations, there's going to be improvements to that pasture condition. So we want to document the before or the benchmark conditions at that time. Now, another time people might choose to do this during the season is at green up, just prior to turnout of the cattle in the spring. Another time might be during peak forage supply periods. So in most of Virginia, that peak period is going to hit about mid-May for most of our cool season perennial pastures. Another time you might want to assess it would be during low forage supply periods. And that oftentimes will be during a drought period in the middle of the summer, typically mid to late July on most years here. And then you may consider going out and doing an assessment near the end of the growing season, perhaps sometime between mid-September and the end of October. But let's talk in practical terms here. I know that all of you are extremely busy. You have many responsibilities, many clients and farmers that you're working with in your service area. So in reality, the pasture condition score should really be done at least once per year. What we try to do is conduct that score the same general time frame or the season each year. That way we can track trends in pasture condition over time, and it won't be skewed by doing it in different seasons from year to year. So whether that's during the spring when you do this annually, or whether it's during the late summer to early fall, you choose when it's a good time for you. But I know a lot of conservationists, they'll do that benchmark condition whenever they go out and meet the farmer. And then from there on, after they've developed a conservation plan, a grazing plan, and that is being implemented, each year, typically late summer, going into fall in that September, October timeframe, we encourage them to go out and do that PCS, to do that annual assessment, and then look at and compare that to the previous year to see what changes have occurred. Oh, wrong way there. All right. You need certain documents with you when you go out to the field to do this. And these are the updated pasture condition score sheet you see here on the left side of the screen. And then on the right side of the screen is a shot of the front of the guide to pasture condition scoring. Both of these were updated in a very productive way. And that, as I said, that was released in January of 2020. I think there were good improvements that were made. In most cases, it kind of simplified and made the score process a little bit more understandable. And that's a good thing. But these are the two documents that you're going to use. You'll see here on the front of this pasture condition score sheet, now that you have the description indicators on the 1 through 5 point range beside each of these indicator descriptions in the left-hand column. So you see right there in that first column, percent desirable plants. As you go across that row to the right, go from the 1 point column, 2 point, 3 point, 4 point, 5 point column. It gives you that description right there on the page that you're working with, and you rate it there in the right-hand column under the score. That'll be a 1 to 5 score. And this is new simply because in the past, on the old score sheet, you had to turn the form over to another page to read these simple descriptions, these brief descriptions. And people didn't like that. So what they did was put all these brief descriptions on the actual page, so you're not having to turn papers on a clipboard while you're out there in the field. So that's a good improvement. Now, because of that, there's only room in that right-hand column to put your score. So some people, don't really like that. They'd rather have multiple columns there so they can rate multiple paddocks on this same page. So what we did, we created a 11 by 17 document where you can print this out, and on to the right, there are many, many columns where you can enter scores for other paddocks that you rate. So that's one solution. Otherwise, you just print one score sheet per paddock that you're rating in the system, and you just keep those together. You do it whichever way you like. Now, this guide to pasture condition scoring, it's a 20-page document. It was expanded a little bit. It's greatly improved. It has more pictures to represent and help you understand how to do the assessments under each indicator. And you just need to know that this is something you want to have with you for a reference in the field. Once you get familiar with the process and the content of this, then you may not use it in the field. You may be comfortable just using the condensed descriptions that you see there on the score sheet on the left. If you have any question about those condensed descriptions, the first place you go is the guide to the pasture condition scoring. And it's a great resource, a lot of good information. It helps explain it very in-depth. And if you haven't already done so, and it's the day after your training, you should go ahead and print that document out just as a desk reference and keep one in your truck for when you're on field visits. So the next question is, where do you find it? Well, we've placed these documents on the field office technical guide, which is open completely to the public, so any of our partners can access it, any producers if they choose, or any consultants who are working in the forage industry. We have it listed, or posted rather, under section 1 of the eFOTG, and then there's a grassland information folder. Once you click that grassland information folder, then it opens up to 2 links, and you want to click the planning support documents link. When you do that, the screen opens up on the right. As you can see, the documents that are under that link, and I've circled in red, got the guide to pasture condition scoring, and also the pasture condition score sheet. These are PDF documents. They're placed right here. Hopefully they will not change for many years. This revision hopefully will last a long time. But any update to this that is done at the national level, we will repost it right back here on the eFOTG. So you can always go there for the most up-to-date version. So that's the kind of the beginning of this training module. Gone over the, what the pasture condition score is for in general, go over the purpose for doing it. I've shown you the documents and where we store those documents. Are there any questions that have come in the chat box so far?
Yeah, I have a few questions. This is Mike Miller.
Okay.
This is probably not for you, JB, but where will the presentation be posted specifically, and will folks be able to get be able to print paper copies of the slides? So will the actual PowerPoint be posted?
Hey, Mike, that's a good question. This is Kevin McLean with the association. We are recording all of these trainings that we're doing this fall and posting them on the association YouTube channel, at which point we send out a link to everybody so they can access it. And then as long as JB is willing to share the PowerPoint slides, we can also turn that into a PDF and post that online as well.
And this question
Sure,
for you, JB.
Sorry, hold on. I'm sorry, let me answer that. Kevin, after the presentation, I'll be glad to convert these slides to PDF and send you a copy for posting, and that way anybody can print those and have those for a reference.
Fantastic. Thank you.
The second question is for soil and water folks. When would the best time to use the pasture conditioning score sheet for the SL10 practice, which is grazing management, to implement cost share?
Yeah, Mike, I want to emphasize the best time to do it is when you go out to do the initial kind of investigation, evaluation on the farm, where you're out there with the farmer, hearing what they are coming to you for, hearing what their goals and objectives are, and they're giving you that farm tour. So you need to either plan enough time that day on that initial visit to walk the different paddocks and conduct the score, or after that first visit, get your maps together, you have a better sense of what they want, then just schedule another day to go out there. Depending on the size of the operation, it may only take 2 or 3 hours to walk and do it, or it may take a half a day or something. But either way, you want to get it and document those benchmark conditions, preferably before you ever put together a conservation plan. Okay?
Thank you, JB.
All right. Well, let's move on and start going through the indicators that you're going to rate as you do this scoring process. Basically, these are the 10 indicators that I've listed here on this slide. Each one is based on a 1 through 5 numerical score, and you're doing this just based on a visual assessment, and it's a snapshot of the day that you're out there doing the evaluation. We all know that conditions change from season to season and from 1 week to the next based on weather conditions. So what you go out, if you were to do that score, today, 4 weeks from now, you go out and do the score, it might be a little bit different. But that's the best we can do. So I'll just throw that out there. That's why it's okay for you to do this multiple times a year if you feel the need, you have to. So each of these 10 indicators we're going to go through in more detail, beginning with, first, the benchmark system assessment. A lot of people will go out and they'll ask, how do I rate the whole pasture, or do I rate the whole pasture as one unit, or do I split pastures into different sections and rate them separately? And how do I base that decision? When you're going out to do the benchmark score, in many cases, if not most cases, the pasture condition is going to be somewhat similar. In most cases, it's going to have uncontrolled grazing. In many cases, it's going to be somewhat overstocked with a lot of hay feeding, probably 140 plus days over the winter time. So, but the other thing to consider and remember is, even though that most farmers that you go out and do that benchmark score on, they have not set up any type of true grazing system, there are going to be some slight differences in grazing impact on different parts of the landscape. For example, if you look at this screenshot here on the right, where I've got this map view of a farm, I've outlined 3 different areas here on the farm. All of this is pretty much continuous grazing, yet it's there are some gates separating these 3 sections that I've outlined in red. But what you're going to see, even you can tell a little bit from the aerial photograph here, that you can even see the scars on the landscape from the satellite view here of where they have fed in this pasture system over the years. But as you're driving through the pastures for the first time on that farm tour, you're going to see that sometimes there's more grazing pressure in areas or pastures that are closer to the water sources. And maybe there's less utilization, less grazing pressure on areas further from the water sources. Likewise, if there's a lot of topography difference from one part of the farm to another, then you're going to see some differences on the pasture conditions score in those situations. And anywhere that there's been concentrated feed areas over the winter time or things like that, it's going to be a different situation on the ground. So once you get out there on site, walking the paddocks, you're going to see that you're going to probably have to split the farm up into certain areas, even for the benchmark system. So in this case, it's probably going to be 3 separate areas that we would split the farm into and just call those the 3 actual paddocks that you're rating. You make that decision on the ground when you get there and once you see what's going on. Now, the second part of that question is, well, that's just for the benchmark system. Once you document the benchmark conditions using that score, then you go back and you plan the conservation plan, address the resource conditions, and if that involves, obviously it's going to involve excluding some of the surface water, setting up some different paddocks. So from that point going forward, you're going to have different paddock boundaries, and we'll likely have more fields to do the following year when you go out and do the follow-up assessment. So let's look at this first indicator, percent desirable plants. You can see right here, this indicator really makes you look close at the plants in that forage sward. Okay, you as the conservationist, as you walk through the paddocks in each area of this system, you're looking closely at the types of plants, the amount of weeds, the amount of canopy cover, the amount of residue on the surface. You literally are evaluating this pasture and this overall system closer than anybody else will probably ever evaluate it, okay? So plan enough time for you to be out there to do a good, thorough job. So number one, you don't miss anything, and we can plan to address any resource concern that you document. But right here, percent desirable plants, we are, you know, when you're managing a pasture system, obviously you want a high percentage of desirable plants in that stand. So on this rating, we're hoping to help the farmer address his management and get him up to a 4 or a 5 in a point score, all right? But in this indicator specifically, we're gonna rate and identify plants that are both desirable and intermediate as far as their likability by the livestock. So keep in mind, desirable species, they're the ones that are readily grazed by the livestock in the system. They're very adapted to site conditions, and they generally provide high quality and a good yield or tonnage throughout the growing season. And intermediate species, they're also readily grazed by the livestock, but unfortunately, these species typically have a shorter growing window throughout the grazing season, or maybe they drop fast in quality once they pass a certain point in the growth stage. Or maybe they're well adapted to this site, they provide some good forage, but they have low productivity potential or low yield potential. So it's a slight negative, but it's not necessarily an undesirable plant. So speaking of undesirables, they're the plants in the system that are typically rejected by the livestock. They have lower quality, or they cause negative side effects when eaten. And because of this, the livestock often avoid these unpalatable plants or these weeds, and they graze more heavily on the desirable species. And that in turn gives the competitive advantage to these weedy, undesirable species. So I asked the group today, well, normally I ask the group, I know y'all aren't on to answer other than the chat box, but what are some desirable grasses that we hope to see in the pasture? And I'll just, and from there, what are some desirable legumes we hope to see in the pasture? I'm going to switch my view right here, and I'm going to show you another document. I've put this together to help you. Mike, can you see this new document on the screen?
Sure can, JB.
Okay, great. Basically, I've put together a short list of common plant species found in Virginia pastures. So the desirable species right here in the left-hand column cool season grasses, you got Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, and tall fescue, maybe some ryegrass, some reed canary grass, some red top. But the main ones that we typically can find are the tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass. They're the big three that we're looking for as far as grasses. As farmers diversify, several more farmers now are using some warm season grass species, and some beneficial ones of those would be eastern gamma grass, switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass, Bermuda grass that's improved or seeded. Also crabgrass, that's an annual, but it is a good warm season filler for our pastures. Moving on to desirable legumes that we often find. Red clover, white clover, ladino clover, some of these annual lespedezas, we can find those out there. Crimson clover, alfalfa, they're all on the list of desirables, and so on and so forth. But let me go back here. Okay. So, depending on the goals of the producer, can some species be desirable that we normally think are undesirable? And the answer to that is yes. Let's look at this photo right here. Desirability of the forage species often depends on the livestock that are managed in the system and the goals of the producer. So right here on the left-hand side of the screen, this picture, it's a side slope on a mountain in Virginia, was overgrown in brushy plants. So this would be a very undesirable pasture for cattle. It's somewhat unproductive and undesirable for cattle. However, this might be the prime goat pasture that anyone could ever have, because goats really like to have a lot of browse, and they like to eat stuff that's up off the ground instead of grazing close to the soil surface. So in one system, this would be undesirable, but in another system, it would be desirable. Likewise, you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, conservationist is standing in a pasture. It looks like it's full of weeds, right? Well, it is, but the primary goal of that farmer whose farm we're on that day is for this pasture to be managed, number one, for wildlife habitat. And then a secondary consideration is just to graze it twice a year for the benefit of cattle and to keep brush from growing up in it and so forth. So in this case, under the goals of the producer, the species that are out here are desirable in this situation, whereas normally we would say no, that this is very undesirable if cattle production or livestock production were the number one priority of this system. So always keep in mind the livestock type that are managed in the pasture, as well as the goals and the intent of the producer when you're doing this. Now, if you look at these pictures right here on the left-hand side, obviously this pasture is basically being managed just as a general pasture for the purpose of livestock production, like most of our pastures are. Even though this is taken in the wintertime, you see some visual indicators here of basically poor pasture performance, but more specifically, some undesirable plants. That being the broom straw or broom sedge that you see in that photo, and also the eastern red cedar that's invading this over the entire pasture landscape. On the right-hand side, you see this pasture is completely grown up in brambles and weeds and so forth. It's very undesirable for general livestock production. If you had goats and they would go in it and you had a fence to keep them in, this might be good for them, but otherwise it would be undesirable pasture. And this one on the right is a very extreme situation, but I did encounter that on a farm just a few years ago. All right, before we move on to percent legume, Mike, are there any questions related to the desirable plant, percent desirable plants indicator?
Yeah, I have a few.
Okay.
So the first question is, so once the benchmark condition has been evaluated, when should you conduct the pasture conditioning score after that point?
Yeah. Once the benchmark condition is documented, then I would recommend doing it at least one time annually. And I like to recommend doing it in sometime between mid-September and the end of October. Okay. Depending on the fall season, if it's really, really dry, like last year was, it might be skewed a little bit. But I think it's a good time of the year to go out there. We're not at peak forage production. We're typically not in an extreme drought at that time of the year, but it would be a good representation of a lot of the species that are present in the pasture and should give you a good snapshot to compare back to that benchmark on how the management has changed and what those changes have resulted in on the pasture landscape.
Okay. So the next question is, for the percent desirable plants, what if you have toxic endophyte infested tall fescue in the pasture and the operator wants to get that out there and mix and plant something different? How should this percent desirable plants be evaluated?
I'm glad that someone here asked that question. And if the producer understands fescue toxicosis and they look at their toxic fescue as being a negative, then we would rate that pasture based on it being an undesirable plant at that point. Okay. Those of us who have been trained on the effects of fescue toxicosis and the toxic endophyte that basically infects most of our fescue across pastures in the state, we know that it's an undesirable characteristic. So once producers understand that and they're looking to address that as a problem or a resource concern, that's when we deem it an undesirable and rate it accordingly. Okay.
And the last question is, are you willing to share your plants PDF that you had on and to address all the other documents that you may share? Could you share all those on top of the PowerPoint?
Yes, I'll be glad to. If Kevin would remind me to do that after the presentation's over, I'll be happy to share those.
I can do that.
Very good. Okay, well, moving on now to percent legume by dry weight. I think most of us recognize the importance of incorporating legumes or clovers into our pasture system with our grass base. Okay, that hinges on the fact that legumes greatly improve the forage quality of our pasture mixes, and they serve as an important source of nitrogen when we get them to a point of over 20% total air dry weight of the pasture stand. So that's kind of what we're shooting for. We're shooting to help farmers change their management and establish legumes, typically clovers, within that mixed stand to get up above 20% by air dry weight. All right, I just want to say right now that, you know, this indicator, just like all the other indicators, you're visually looking at the stand, visually rating legume or percent legume composition in the stand. But when we look and we go dig a little bit deeper in the guide to pasture condition scoring, it talks a little bit more in depth about, based on that visual observation, how you take that and extrapolate air dry weight percentage with the best estimate you can. So basically, you want to visually estimate this as you go across the field. You know, a 30 to 40% legume content is the highest score you can get. Now, do you really need 30 to 40%? No. And is it achievable? Yes. And most of you know that from year to year, the amount of legumes in a pasture, it cycles. And sometimes we can't explain why we have such a flush and growth of clover in a given spring. I know this year we had a lot of clover that was prominent in pastures this spring, but that doesn't happen every year. And I don't care if a farmer is frost seeding clover on 30% of their pasture every year. You know, sometimes that kicks in pretty quick, and sometimes it's a few years later before it really shows that flush and increase in clover content. Now, the one thing that some farmers or all farmers need to be concerned with is if they get too high of a content of clover in their mixed stand, then it has a potential to cause bloat. Now, the clovers that we typically use, the white clover, red clover, Ladina clover, they're all bloating type legumes. There are a list of non-bloating legumes that are not as common as far as to be seeded in the pasture, but I'll go over that in just a minute. You just want to keep in mind, you know, research documents the fact that when you can get a sufficient legume content in this pasture mix, it produces more milk and it yields more pounds on our calves that are being raised in the system. And that's documented by research. So that's another good reason that we want that there. Keep in mind, let's look at this right here. Just take a look at this slide. And visually, when you're looking straight down in this pasture canopy as this picture is taken, you can see a great deal of clover, those broad trifoliate leaves of clover when you look down. It's a pretty high percentage in relation to the surface area that you're seeing of the grasses, right? And this is a little bit of an illusion because these clover leaves are flat and they open up to catch as much sunlight as they can, whereas the grass that you see extending up through the lens in that picture, it's more upright. So we don't see the leaves as prominently because there's a lot of clover in there. But just looking at this, you know, you may say there's 60% clover just visually in that, right? Well, when I clipped it and I separated the clover out from the grass and I dried it all down to get the air dry weight, this is what was left over in this picture here on the right. And in actuality, when you weigh it out, it's about 31% legume by dry weight of that representative sample that I took from that picture right there. So let's look at some of these. These pictures here came straight out of the Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring. When you do a visual assessment here on the left picture, you see there's not a whole lot of clover there, and the visual assessment is estimated at about 10%. But when they did the separation, they dried it down, turned out to be 6% dry weight of the clover in there relative to the grass. So it's not much. You know, over here on the right-hand picture in the slide, look closely at that, and in your mind right now, I want you to estimate what's the visual percent clover in that picture. Hopefully you're somewhere close to about 30% visually represented by clover. When they dried it all down, guess what? 15%. So for your red clover, your white clover, your Ladina, if we're visually seeing with our eyes 30%, then we're gonna drop that down by about 50, or about half rather, 50% or half, and we're gonna give the dry weight percentage, we're gonna call it 15. Okay, and that's something really need to train our eyes to look at and to understand. If we're visually seeing 30% in the pasture, then really, if we drive that down, it's going to be much closer to 15%. Okay, look right here. This table, or the clovers in these two columns rather, I took straight out of the Southern Forage's 5th edition. It was published in 2015. It's a list of bloating legumes and then a list of non-bloating legumes. So if you look right there on the left, we typically see the Ladina clover, the white clover, the red clover in our pastures. They're the main clovers that we use and we seed and we recommend. They're all bloating legumes. Whereas on the right, you see a whole list of other legumes. Sometimes we see Serratia lespedeza in our pastures, and due to the anti-quality factors, the tannins in that, livestock typically avoid that. So, they're not going to bloat from it to start with. But even if they did consume a lot of it, it is a non-bloating legume. Likewise, some pastures often have a lot of annual lespedeza or common lespedeza in them. This is another example of a non-bloating legume. And then, let's see, cowpea. Some farmers are planting annual mixes. They may include cowpea. It's a common summer legume that's included in that annual mix. And just know that that's a non-bloating legume, or they very rarely, if ever, would cause bloat in that right-hand column. All right, before we move on to the next one, Mike, are there any questions relating to percent legume content?
No, JB, there was no questions on this one, but if Carl stated in the chat box for DCR, and well, I guess everybody can go check out the association website for species list and more information on previous trainings about pasture conditioning and Russell too.
Very good, very good. All right, let's move on to the next indicator right now. The title of this one is Live Plant Cover. And on both the PCS score sheet as well as the guide, in parentheses, it says includes dormant. So this in itself is somewhat confusing, right? Why does it say it's live plant cover, but then says includes dormant plant cover? Well, basically, the answer to that is we want to visually assess the total plant cover that's there. And then in the end, before we do the rating, we're saying if the total plant cover that's present is, let's say 95% canopy covers this pasture, how much of that is dormant, standing dead, right? Because the greater partition of the canopy that's standing dormant or dead cover, it takes away from the benefit of an actively growing pasture. So basically, this indicator just looks at the overall percentage of the soil surface covered by plant material or the canopy, an important role of pasture production in soil and water protection. This includes all plant cover, both living and dead, from desirable or undesirable plants. So, what we're looking for is a dense stand when it's properly grazed. And we all know that if we have a thick, dense stand with a good canopy cover, that's going to result in the higher animal intake, high sunlight interception. It's going to be a high percent plant cover, 90% or above. And those normally yield better and grow back faster if we can let that plant recover and replenish that canopy again. And people say, well, when's the best time to rate canopy cover? The fact is, you've got to rate each paddock the day you're out there. Okay. Now, in a perfect world, you would rate canopy cover or this live plant cover just prior to rotating your livestock into a new paddock where the canopy has grown out pretty full. That's when you would want to rate it. But as I said, you got to rate all the paddocks the day you're out there. Some of the paddocks the livestock will be grazing in the day you rate them. Some of them will have been grazed down, hopefully to that recommended stop grazing height of about 4 inches or more, just the day before you got there. So the canopy cover in that paddock will not be as good as the canopy cover in the paddock that the livestock are getting ready to be turned into sometime in the next few days. And that's understandable. Now, you'll see a lot of different types of canopy cover on the different farms that you go out to. But what's shown in the pictures here may be some of the more common types of canopy cover that you will encounter when you're going out to do the benchmark scores. So low percent plant cover definitely causes some problems, okay? It results in bare and open spots. And these bare and open spots in the canopy allow for other things to intrude, including weeds to encroach and get a hold. It allows for potentially increased rainfall runoff. There's less canopy to catch those raindrops, to allow them to infiltrate slowly down into the soil instead of just hitting the ground and starting to run down the slope, which then could lead to possible erosion problems, yes, even in a pasture. This can occur often because of the severity of use or the uncontrolled grazing of a highly stocked pasture system. That's what generally leads to low plant canopy or plant cover. Low soil pH and low soil fertility could be contributing factors. If the plants don't have the plant food needed to grow and be robust and vigorous, then they're not going to produce a thick and a quick canopy. In certain cases, you might run into a situation where, due to something in the landscape, the species that are planted there and trying to be managed just are not adapted well to the site conditions. And then also, we can have some impacts of short-term climate stress, especially in the summertime, that would result in poor plant canopy cover. Because once we rotate, even in a well-managed grazing system, if we're going through June, we're rotating the livestock through there, grazing everything down to the recommended grazing heights. If we enter a drought period where the grass is just not growing back very fast at all, then that can cause some short-term low plant cover percentages. And then rare, but sometimes the case occurs where severe insect or disease pressure could result in lower plant canopy. Again, that's rare, but sometimes I've seen fall armyworm come in and really destroy some pasture. Just a few times over the last 12 years have I seen that. All right, before we go into plant diversity, Mike, are there any questions that came in regarding the plant cover indicator?
Yeah, JB, there's not a question for this one, but I did miss the last minute question for the previous one, and it was asking about Lespedeza being an invasive species. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. That's in the legume question. You know, Serratia lespedeza, we do classify that as an invasive species. It's good for you to be able to be aware and know what it looks like, to be able to identify it, and to help make any kind of recommendation. Number one, to either contain it, or if the farmer really wants to get rid of it, you know, definitely direct them to the local extension agent for them to come up with a herbicide control plan that would treat that Serratia lespedeza at the right time of the growing season to be most effective in killing it out. Now, since it is on our invasive species list, it is not in our plant establishment guide. Okay, we're not allowed to recommend it to be planted as part of a conservation plan at all. However, if it is there, and you know, the thing about Serratia lespedeza has a pretty big taproot, and it's pretty aggressive. And once it gets over about 15 inches tall, the tannin levels really increase inside the plant, and it makes it very unpalatable for cattle. Now, if a farmer happens to have goats, those goats will browse it and graze it with no problem. And sometimes, if you ever tune into any type of goat webinar or something like that, they might actually refer to or recommend Serratia lespedeza. But they're the only ones, the only type of livestock that I know of that really will will browse it and or graze it to keep it in check. So we don't recommend it anymore. Out in Southwest Virginia on some of the reclaimed strip mine areas, it was planted there. It's one of the plants that can sustain or actually establish and sustain under a very acidic soil type, which is what those mine spoils are based on. And it is a good vegetation for that area, and they do run some stockers on it, but they have to keep it in a vegetative state that's pretty short as they rotate them throughout there. Okay. All right, let's move on to plant diversity by dry weight. As you look at plant diversity in the canopy, this score describes the number and the abundance of well-represented forage plants and different plant functional groups in a paddock. Okay, so it looks closely at the number of different forage species and functional groups that are well represented or dominant in a pasture. And for the new pasture condition scoring to be considered, for a species to be considered a dominant species, which makes it well represented, it has to be greater than or equal to 15% composition in that one paddock. Okay. If we have plant species representing or represented from different functional groups, that can really increase annual forage production and minimize seasonal forage disruptions or low spots, summer slump, things like that. If you look right here, this is one of the indicators where you really have to take some time and you have to read very carefully the 5 different levels right here from left to right as it's shown on the screen. All right, one thing that you want to note, you're looking for the number of dominant desirable species and the number of functional groups represented. We're not going to take the time to read through each of these 5 individually. That's something you really have to do while you're out there in the field, and you'll have to study that and you'll have to put this into practice. But if you go through it systematically, trust me, you'll understand it and you'll get the hang of it and be able to use it. And one thing I will say, I want to draw your attention to the left-hand column that has actually the 1 score, which is a very low plant diversity. If at any time your desirable species in that paddock is less than 50% of the total biomass, or your desirable species is lower than your undesirable species, then you automatically score it a 1. Okay? That's something that's new and it's improved for this new PCS version. So a low or poor species diversity often results in pastures to be less reliable suppliers of forage throughout the growing season. In contrast to that, high pasture diversity, it tends to compensate and perform more consistently through the seasonal climate stress going from spring to summer to fall and into the winter. So in general, good representation of different functional plant groups is a sign of good plant diversity. And there are 4 basic functional groups. These include warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, and other forbs. In this other forb category, some of us would call those weeds, but these would be weeds that are somewhat grazed by livestock in the system. I look at that as chicory, as dock, things like that. So when we do this rating, we're estimating, doing a visual estimate and then estimating it by dry weight. I want to ask you this question. Does higher diversity always result in higher productivity? Think about that for a minute. We're saying we want more diversity in this pasture, but does it always result in higher productivity? The answer is no, not always. It really depends on the species that are present and if they're equally desirable by the livestock. So think about this in terms of native warm season grass mixes as an example. If we were planting a mixture of native warm season grasses, and we have this mixture commonly that we recommend, it's big blue stem, Indian grass, and little blue stem. Those three plants go well together, and they tend to complement each other, and livestock that graze them tend to graze it evenly. They don't select one of those species over the other two that are in the mix. But there's a reason that we do not put switchgrass in that same mix. We don't add that fourth species, because when it's in that mix, the livestock will avoid switchgrass and prefer the others. And therefore, over time, they'll overgraze perhaps the others and give a competitive advantage to the switchgrass, which then will take over more and more percent of that canopy over time. So that's a good example where higher diversity does not always result in higher productivity. So think about this next question. What if the pasture is made up of 50% undesirable species? How does this affect the overall diversity score? I went over that in the previous slide. It's automatically rated a 1. So what percent of the sward does a species have to surpass to be considered a dominant species under the diversity rating? You should have picked that up on the last slide. It's got to be greater than 15% to be considered a dominant species. So how can a functional group be counted even if it does not have a dominant species? Okay, think about that. If the cumulative percent of the species that are in the same functional group, if you add those up and they're greater than 15%, then that functional group can be counted as one of them represented in the stand. For example, if you're looking at the legume composition or the legumes as a diversity dominant species, let's say you only have 10% of white clover. As long as you have at least 5% of red clover in there as well, and you add those two together, and you've got clover represented as another functional group there, totaling a minimum of 15%. So that's one good example of that. Okay, before we move to that one, are there any questions regarding plant diversity by dry weight that we just covered?
JB, we had no questions come through the chat box.
Okay. Let's look at the next one here. Plant residue as litter and soil cover. Plant residue as litter and soil cover. Soil cover is important for many reasons, okay? For many reasons. Plant residue can provide valuable protection to the soil surface as long as that layer of residue is not excessively thick. And the way you rate this, the soil cover rating, is assessed by looking on the soil surface between the plant bases, between their tillers and between the stolons. All right. So we're not walking over the canopy looking down. We're spreading the canopy with our hands, opening up that canopy so that, number one, we can see the soil surface. And on that soil surface, we can see how much of a percentage of that soil is covered by either plant residue or litter in some phase of decomposition. You can see right here on the 1 to 5 ratings that you see on the screen in that row going across, you know, what we're hoping we can manage this in a way where it's 61% or greater. So we're looking to achieve a 4 or a 5 score, 61% or greater, residue cover on that soil surface. Now, ground cover residue basically is the dead leaves or stems on the ground between the plant bases. Dead leaves or stems on the ground between the plant bases. This residue is in various states of decay. It does provide good additional surface cover and contributes to the organic matter content in the soil. As this breaks down year after year after year, it adds organic matter to that surface horizon of soil. So is there such a thing as too much residue? And if so, then why? Answer to that is yes. If the residue layer forms a thick thatch that can inhibit new seedling emergence and inhibit tiller growth. A buildup of thatch is often an indicator of retarded residue decay. Either the microbes there in the surface of the soil, along with the other soil organisms like earthworms and so forth, if they cannot keep up with the amount of residue that's accumulating on the soil surface, then something's a little bit out of balance. In some cases, a thick thatch layer can promote fungal diseases that then can infect the plants and be detrimental to the stand in that way. Overall, if we have a constant thick thatch from year to year, we typically see that pasture thinning out over time in a state of decline. So these are 4 good reasons why we need to pay close attention to this as we rate this indicator of plant residue on the soil surface. And in some cases, it's not that often, but in some cases, we see where a thatch is too thick, and we need to key in on that. And what are some of the desirable effects that plant residue and litter has as soil cover, and what do they provide in a pasture? This thin residue layer can buffer the soil temperature, can increase rainfall infiltration, can help protect and cover the soil, prevent soil erosion, can improve soil moisture retention. And over time, it does contribute to soil organic matter increases. So these are 5 definite positive benefits that we want to, or reasons that we want to manage for at least some plant residue and litter as cover on the bare soil surface. So what would you say constitutes a healthy level of plant litter and soil residue? If you have a nice layer of plant residue to cover and insulate the soil, providing some moisture retention benefits while not being so thick and excessive to inhibit seed germination or cause stand thinning. So you want just kind of a medium level that has the characteristics to provide us the benefits to the system and not the negative impacts. So you've got to hit that sweet spot. All right. Are there any questions about plant residue as litter and soil cover?
Yeah, I have one.
Go ahead.
Could soil compaction result in that thicker thatch layer? Be a result of that for the microbes?
I guess if compaction is a contributing detriment to the microbial activity in the soil, which sometimes it can be, then that could be one of the causes. Yes. And we're going to get to that rating of the compaction in just a few minutes. So that's a good thought, Mike. All right, let's move on now to grazing utilization and severity. This is basically talking about the proper amount and frequency of grazing of a pasture. And if it's done and managed properly, it's critical really to maintaining productive pastures. This rating was previously known as uniformity of use in the old PCS score sheet, but now it's changed to grazing utilization and severity. Now, the level of grazing utilization and severity in a pasture can tell you so much about how that system is being managed and the performance of that system. What are some things that may cause uneven grazing to occur? Think about that. What causes uneven grazing? Well, different forage species, plant maturity, and stocking rates can cause uneven grazing, specifically stock density. If you have very low stock density, I need to add that to this line. But if you have very low stock density, then cattle have plenty of room to move around and just selectively graze what's most palatable at the time. And then any plants that are present at that time that are in a more mature state where the seed head has already emerged, Obviously, those plants are less palatable at that stage of growth, in that stage of maturity, so they're going to avoid those. And then if you have different forage species in that mix that are very different from each other, some are naturally going to be more palatable than others, and that contributes to a lower grazing utilization. Here's a big one: the location and distance to water, shade, and mineral sources. You'll often find heavier grazing pressure on those paddocks immediately adjacent to the water sources. This is something we all see when we rate these pastures in the field. But the same happens depends on where the shade is. Because after they graze, they're going to go lay in the shade. So they're going to want to stay close to the shade, close to the water, and in certain places, close to the mineral feeder. So how does close grazing and frequent grazing, how do they affect these other plant condition indicators? Well, close and frequent grazing has a direct effect on plant cover. That means canopy cover, plant vigor, and stand density. Because if we graze it close and we graze it close frequently, then what's it gonna do? It's gonna remove plant cover, it's gonna weaken plant vigor, and thin the stand density. And there are three negatives to close and frequent grazing. Now again, close and frequent grazing is typically found in the benchmark or beginning condition. And that's why we rate those pastures at that time before we issue the recommendations in the conservation plan and before grazing system is set up. The proper amount and frequency of grazing is critical to maintaining productive pastures, as I said before. You can see right here on the left side of this slide, there's a photo of even grazing of palatable forage species in a managed grazing system. Basically, the farmer has some division fences. He's managing his herd at higher stock densities, and they graze it more uniformly. Here on the right, in contrast to that, we've got very spotty, uneven grazing, avoiding the fescue, actively grazing the crabgrass. And this pasture here on the right has been overgrazed for years. A lot of the desirable forage species that was originally planted there has been grazed out. And right now, all those tufts of fescue, that's basically grass that's grown up in manure urine patches that the cattle are just avoiding this first round through until that breaks down more further. Okay, Mike, any question on grazing utilization and severity?
Yeah, we have two questions, JB. First question is what is the proper distance for available water sources?
Okay, the proper distance for available water sources. For a cattle system, if we could plan it in an optimum situation, we'd like to have water planned so the cattle don't have to walk much further than about 800 linear feet from the water source. Now, depending on the size and the orientation of that paddock, sometimes we stretch that up to about 1,000 linear feet if it doesn't make sense to split it and put in another water. So you just have to use your judgment as a conservationist on the ground. But under optimum situations, we like them not to have to walk much further than about 800 feet. What's the next question, Mike?
All right. Next question is, how much shade from trees do individual pastures or management units need? And is this a percentage? And should we be allowing areas in the woods to be fenced in to provide shade areas?
The whole shade issue is it's a really big debate. And each year that passes, it seems like it's a bigger and stronger debate. But in past years and previous research, the performance of the cattle system did not seem to be impacted much by not having shade. Okay. However, when you factor in that a lot of our pastures are based in toxic endophyte fescue. And we know that that somewhat exacerbates the heat stress because the cattle, they can't dissipate their heat as well if they're struggling from fescue toxicosis. And a lot of our conservation stewards or good farmers out there are willing to work with you at the local conservation office to exclude their livestock from the streams and from the riparian areas. And historically, these riparian areas down by the streams and ponds have had trees where they lounge in and they seek shelter and relief out of the intense heat of the summer. And if they're struggling with their body temperature due to fescue toxicosis, that also contributed to them going into the streams and or the ponds to just help them cool themselves. So knowing that a lot of Virginia has an underlying stress of fescue toxicosis, then I would say, I think it's very important that during the conservation planning process that you look for ways, you look for areas that you can make sure they have access back to trees for shade cover to help relieve them from some of the stress, because we're fencing them out of the areas that they used to seek shelter in the shade, used to cool themselves in the water. And then if all we do is force them out into the sun to sit there and have to endure the intense heat of our summers, then number one, we're not doing them any favors. Number two, their performance definitely is going to, I think, go down. And they really need some access back to shade. Anyway, I hope that answers that question.
We have another couple questions that came in. Isn't it known that when shade is provided, the livestock will concentrate in those areas where a majority of the manure and other fluids are being placed? And I have one more question after that.
That's very true in most cases. Okay, and that's kind of the double-edged sword. You know, if we fence them out of the areas where they've normally laid and sought shelter and cooled themselves, and we don't provide shade anywhere else, where they're going to lay somewhere. Okay, but if we do provide selected shade, and in some cases, I see farmers purchasing these really nice new engineered shade structures that are made to be portable. They're fairly expensive, so most farmers don't have them at this time. But if farmers are using a shade structure, then the cattle will, yes, they'll congregate under that. That's why it's important to move it. I would say move it every few days, so that number one, it does not accumulate a whole lot of manure in one spot in the pasture. It doesn't cause a degraded area or bare patches in the pasture, and the negative consequences that go along with both of those. We have a revised conservation standard now. We revised it early this year. It's called Windbreak and Shelter Belt. And we've made it so that you don't have to plan that practice as densely as they call for a windbreak. If the real purpose is just for a shelter belt, you can plan it thin, and you can plan it specifically for providing a shade shelter belt in an appropriate spot in the pasture. Now, again, that does not maximize the spreading of the manure across the pasture, but you kind of have to hit that balance. And some cattle will do okay without much shade, but some of them really need it. Those that struggle worse in the heat, they tend to really need it. So, the system's not going to be perfect. As perfect as we can plan it on paper, oftentimes does not match with reality on the ground, and we gotta find that happy medium. What's that next one, Mike?
This actually is on the previous question about what your response. And does this take into does this take into consideration that our historic average of 90 plus days is 45, but the last few years we have seen more than 60 to 90 plus days
that are 90 degrees or above?
I believe so.
Yeah. In general, I'm acknowledging that our livestock struggle from intense heat. That the number of days ranges from year to year, and it's going to change back and forth. But if our pastures remain in toxic endophyte fescue, and we fence them out of the water sources and the shade areas and the riparian areas that they have historically used, then it's going to exacerbate the fescue toxicosis issue and the stress on the animal. It's going to lower their performance. So we need to use the tools that are available to us and consider all of them in that planning process if it helps meet the farmer's goals to provide shade. Okay? Good questions. Good questions.
We have one more question that came in, JD.
Okay.
And it's, why don't we offer cost share for portable shades? I think they work well, but do not believe they are available as part of cost share. And I believe you can only answer from the NRCS side, correct?
Yeah, and from NRCS, we had that as what we call an interim standard, which is where we use a standard for a few years on a trial basis. And according to that NRCS standard, it had to be built to meet the engineer specifications, had to be anchored to the ground so it wouldn't be picked up by wind, turned over, flipped, and or destroyed. And at the same time, it had to be made so that it could be portable. So we had design drawings for it, and basically nobody was satisfied. Okay, the producers who got the design drawings, they did not want to build it. Most of them did not want to build it according to the design. They said they could build it cheaper and have something functional on their own. And secondly, the ones who did build it, many of them did not move it. They started off moving it from one paddock to another, but then they would quit. And when you quit moving a shade structure, it results in, other resource concerns, a concentration of nutrients, bare spots, weed areas, and more flies around the livestock. So considering all that on that 3-year trial period, and again, that might have been 10 years ago when we had that, there was a University of Kentucky publication on shade structures that was published that I found about that time, and basically had the design recommendations in there. And since then, we've just made that publication available to any farmer who is seeking shade structures so they can know the size and the general ways that they can design them and build them themselves. That way, they don't have to build them according to our specifications. They can use them for as long as they want to use them if they choose to. And if the wind picks them up and blows them away, then they're not out of, they don't have to build it back to our standards again. The other thing about portable shade structures is most portable practices NRCS does not cost share on, simply because it could be hooked behind a truck and carried somewhere else at any given day. But the main reasons are, when we tried these shade structures, people were not managing them, and over time it just resulted in different resource concerns. And also, a lot of people didn't want to build a structure or didn't want to build enough shade structures to provide the shade necessary for the entire herd that was being managed together. Okay.
I have one more question that came in so far.
Yes, sir.
If we pay on watering systems to get animals out of the streams and rivers, why do we also allow limited access water areas for these producers to allow animals back in the water? Oftentimes, these limited access water areas are fenced. However, every farmer I know that has one keeps the gate open and animals have access full time.
Well, I guess from what I understand from an NRCS standpoint, that by limiting access to just a few water access points along the entire stream boundary is a great deal of improvement in most cases to water quality and the stream bank stabilization as compared to the before conditions. Okay. I know most of our planners when they plan these scenarios out and provide these alternatives to the landowners, they're really looking at and encouraging putting in a pipeline system supporting water troughs that are spaced very strategically across the landscape to give them the most benefit of grazing utilization throughout their entire system. And from what I can tell, most of the farmers are going along with those recommendations and putting in that full watering system. If they put in gates to the streams, it should be only on an emergency access basis, as long as they've got water trough operational in that paddock. In certain times, I know, whether it be severe, we've had storms in the summer where it knocks out power, had storms in the fall with tropical storms and hurricanes, which sometimes knocks out power for many days. And, you know, they've got to be able to open up a gate and provide them access to the stream if the power's out and they can't pump the water to them through the normal trough system. That's just a matter of keeping those livestock alive until we can get back through to where we can manage it normally. Okay. All right, good questions. Let's move on now to the livestock concentration area indicator. This changed a little bit from the previous score sheet, but I think it also is improved here. This indicator requires you to look closely and think about where the livestock concentrate or congregate their activity at certain times of the day or at seasons of the year. You need to pay close attention to the size of the loafing area, the location and severity of the livestock concentration areas, because this can greatly impact both the soils, the water, and the plant resources in the overall pasture system. Now this indicator hinges on any concentration area that's over 1/10 of 1 acre in size and with a proximity to surface water or direct conveyance channel. So how big is 1/10 of 1 acre? You know, it's not very big. It's, I think, 66 by 66. 66 feet by 66 feet is approximately 1/10 of an acre. So it doesn't take many cows to lay down or congregate together in a general area where they loaf day after day to produce one of these concentration areas. And depending on how closely that concentration area is to a water source or to a channel that flows directly into the water source, that's what's going to influence the point score 1 through 5 on this specific indicator. All right, let's look right here. Livestock trails. If you follow livestock trails, they'll often lead you to the frequent loafing areas where the livestock congregate, and that impacts and its impact on manure nutrients, okay? This indicator also accounts for the size and proximity of the area to the water sources. Look right here on the left. We see the intense trailing down by the stream. You can even see some of the stream banks sloughing off where the cattle obviously go up and down the stream bank to get some water right there in the picture. Okay, it's directly adjacent to the stream, so there's direct runoff impacts from that. If you look here on the right-hand side, this is somewhat typical on farms in different regions of the states, but these concentration areas are often associated with feeding sites, winter feeding sites. And if historically, if they've fed either beside a pond or beside a stream like this picture right here, then it's a direct impact where we have the concentrated manure running directly down the slope into this stream. And oftentimes, if you are designing a conservation plan and helping them get a grazing system, that is the time to convince them we need to move or shift this heavy use feeding area. We need to exclude it or exclude the stream from that area. Hopefully they'll be willing to plant a riparian buffer that would further buffer any runoff down into that stream and really get them focused on grazing more days of the year, reducing the number of hay feeding days overall, and minimizing the negative impact of these feed-related concentration areas. Let's look at some more concentration type areas that are commonly seen. In the shade, as we already talked about the impact of shade. Cattle need shade, they seek that shade. Down, you can often see outside of the actual pasture, the grassed area itself, they'll seek shade down in the woods. And if the woods are by a creek, it's like a magnet. They go right down there, and they'll camp out in these concentration areas by the stream in the shade. You can see that there on the left. You can see it may not be greater than 1/10 of an acre on this particular site here on the left, but it is directly adjacent to the stream, where any runoff is going to take those manure nutrients right in there. So this would score a low score on that concentration area indicator. Over here on the right, we've got a concentration area where we see them seeking shade by the edge of the fence adjacent to these tall pines. Where this is located, it's not causing a negative water quality impact. They're excluded on this farm from the creeks, and they're just trying to find shade on the edge of that paddock where the trees cast that shade over into the pasture at different times of the day. So it's not a big issue there. Would it be better if those nutrients were spread evenly over the pasture? Yes. However, when it's really hot and they need shade, they're going to seek it. All right. Before we go to the next slide, are there any questions that have come in on these concentration areas, Mike?
Yes. If a riparian forest buffer is being planned and the livestock have access to the stream, what is the minimum distance for the fence from the water's edge?
If a riparian forest buffer is being planned and livestock,
how far is the distance for a fence out is the general
yeah,
question.
for the NRCS conservation practice standard for a riparian forested buffer, it's got to be a minimum of 35 feet.
And I can answer for DCR. For DCR, for RPA streams, it's a minimum of 35 feet. Non-RPA streams can go down to 10.
Okay, very good.
In general.
Yeah, we can do, even on the NRCS side, we can do a strict exclusion, which does not include a riparian buffer, and that exclusion can be down to 10 feet. Okay, any other question, Mike?
Yes, one just came in. Do you recommend uncovered winter feeding pads for placing round bale feeders?
It all depends. I know we in NRCS, we do not plan and financially assist with putting in uncovered feeding pads anymore. I think 10 years ago we used to, and we've moved away from that. I think if, for uncovered feeding out on the pasture, in a lot of cases, if you identify the right location to do a lot of that feeding, then it can greatly reduce the negative impact from runoff to any surface water on that farm. So location is what it's all about. And yes, it's gonna destroy the sod in that feeding area, but in the context of a prescribed grazing plan, we have to identify and label what we call a sacrifice lot. And that sacrifice lot is usually part of one of the grazing paddocks. So what we're designating is that in the wintertime, when it's too wet and the soil is too soggy and vulnerable to drive across with a tractor to feed hay, and for the livestock to be on treading and pugging, to be eating hay out there. Then we bring the livestock herd back into this sacrifice area, and we feed hay in a concentrated fashion in that area for a certain length of time. And that length of time is determined based on the weather conditions during that period of the year. Oftentimes, most winters, we'll go through different spells where it's just really wet and saturated. We'll pull them in, and once things dry down, you can get back on the upland pasture, the side slope pasture, to unroll hay or to feed hay out there, and it won't be that detrimental. The important thing is we need to move that hay feeding site around. If the soils are dry, we can feed on the overall pasture. We want to move it around so we're not causing bare spots. We're not denuding the good sod in the pasture, but rather systematically unrolling hay across the pasture, having them eat and clean that up. And there's always going to be a little bit of waste hay, but it's gonna break down, and the nutrients associated with it are going to go back in the soil and feed the grass over the next couple years. So
Yeah.
I hope I answered that.
Yeah, there was in response to that, would that area be considered a heavy use area that could have gravel and geotextile fabric?
The sacrifice area that I'm referring to, it may be several acres in size. Okay. At the very most, as part of our prescribed grazing standard, the sacrifice area in any given year cannot total more than 10% of the grazing acres. That, just to put that in perspective, if we have a 100-acre grazing system and we had a really, really wet winter, the most acreage that we could sacrifice for winter feeding would be 10 acres of that. Okay, so in most winters, we would not need to sacrifice that whole 10 acres, but rather we might be able to get by with 3 or 4 acres on a normal winter season. Now, within that 3 or 4 acres, if a farmer themselves or a farmer working with DCR, if they wanted to implement put in some type of pad where they wanted to concentrate more of that feeding on, that's up to the individual farmer or up to, I guess, the district they're working with. But that's out of NRCS. If we're gonna put in a hardened area to feed on in NRCS, then it's gonna be a roofed area. But really, I guess I'm gonna get back to my first point related to this is, if we can designate the right location for that sacrifice area in the context of the overall system, then in many cases, I think that the amount of destruction or sacrifice can be greatly minimized, and we not have to put in a whole lot of structural components at all. I know that won't work on every farm, but if they're truly looking to do more grazing and less feeding and modify their stocking rates accordingly to achieve that goal, then we can greatly decrease the hay feeding days compared to the average system, and we can greatly minimize the effect on the landscape and the adjacent water resources at the same time. Okay.
I have not received any more questions, so I'll assume.
Very good. Very good. All right, let's move on right now to soil compaction and soil regenerative features. This is an expanded indicator compared to what we used to have. It used to just be soil compaction, but the soil health team at the national level, they worked with the group that was revising this assessment tool, and they incorporated these other regenerative features to be visually assessed and considered when rating this indicator. So you can see right here, there's 4 of them from top to bottom on the left side. That being compaction is 1, roots is 2, soil color is 3, and soil life is 4. And I just want to say, the first one, and in my opinion, the one that's most important is the soil compaction indicator. And soil compaction in general can often be overlooked, but at the same time, it can have devastating impacts to the pasture performance in that paddock. Here's a slide right here with two pictures. On the left, you see a pasture. It's actually a horse pasture that was managed with very high stocking rates. It was continuously overgrazed and resulted in a lot of soil compaction under that paddock. And if you look beneath the surface, you've got to take a shovel or a spade out with you to really look beneath the surface. I dug this part of the sod up, and you can just see when you look at the profile of that soil right there I'm holding in my hand in that photo, it's just compacted, and the structure is what they call massive. Okay, you cannot see necessarily the individual aggregates. It's compacted to the point where it's just called massive structure. In this situation where you have very high stock densities, continuous overgrazing, it results in very low canopy cover, minimal soil surface residue, and often cases severe compaction. And in my opinion, this results in what I call a triple threat to soil erosion. Because once it rains in situations like that, there's not much to hold the soil particles together. And once they're detached, they're easily suspended and flow in that sheet runoff. So the soil compaction directly impacts water infiltration and runoff, as well as soil water availability. So we begin rating the indicator using the primary sub-indicators. The primary indicator, the first one is soil compaction. What you want to do is make sure you have a spade with you in the field, and you dig a very, very small pit. It doesn't even have to be a pit necessarily. You just need to be able to see the structure in that surface horizon of soil, kind of as I've shown in the picture here on the right. You can see the aggregates that are present, the soil aggregates that are present in there has good aggregation. This one, compared to the first picture, this one has very somewhat platy structure. You can see there in the top of that soil that I pulled out in that shovel as a layer that's about 1 inch thick. That's just very hard and compacted. Beneath that, it starts falling apart in a platy structure. Now, this soil, the day I was out there digging this, had optimum soil moisture. Okay, it had just rained the day before. It was a slow rain. It had soaked down through this compacted profile. But what you see right here in this photo, you can see the platy structure present, which is very indicative of some compaction. And then right here, this third scenario, you saw that in the previous slide. There's no noticeable soil structure. It's very firm, hard. It's considered massive structure. So there's 3 different ones. The first one being very good, friable, good aggregate structure. The second being platy. And then the third being massive that you're looking at right there. So you want to rate it accordingly to what you see in the given paddock that you're in. Another thing to keep in mind, if you can pinch it between your fingers, some of these soil aggregates, if it's got platy structure, you pinch it between your fingers and it kind of pops or bursts, and that's indicative of a fragipan right there. And typically you'd find those at a certain depth beneath a crop field. All right, next you want to look at the second primary sub-indicator, which is the root characteristics. All right, so when you dig that shovel full of soil down in the top 8 to 10 inches of soil, you just want to visibly look and note something about the root characteristics. How numerous are they? How few are they? Or are they in between, moderate? In which direction do they grow? Do they grow vertically, extending down 6 to 12 inches? or do they immediately turn horizontal at a certain layer in there? And that gives us an indicator of the soil structure, maybe a compaction layer, which restricts root growth. That's what you want to look at under this sub-indicator. You can see right here in this picture, it just popped up in the lower right corner. In that platy structured soil that I showed before, the roots tend to stop and go kind of horizontal through those fractures between the plates of soil. All right. Now, then the first two indicators are primary indicators, that being compaction and root structure. Now, the second two indicators under this are what we call secondary. We're looking at soil color and then soil life. But in this first, the soil color, hold on. The color may change in the soil, but we all know from our soil science classes and what you've learned from the soil scientists since you've been working at your job perhaps, that it's natural for soil color to be different as you go down through the soil profile from the surface horizon to the next horizon beneath that, maybe to the next horizon beneath that. There's some natural inherent soil colors. What you're looking at here is contrast the soil color at the very, very surface within a few inches from the surface. If the soil had been terribly eroded before it was converted to pasture land, you may only have 2 inches of an AP horizon, and then it would convert to the subsoil horizon, which would change the color. This is something I want to point out to you about soil color and the soil biological activity or soil life, which we're going to talk about next. These two indicators, you make notes about them, but these two scores for these sub-indicators do not factor in to the actual compaction score. Only compaction and root life or root structures actually tabulates into this overall score. You look further at soil color just for your own benefit, see if you can visually see anything. Then you look for soil life. You look for the presence of worms, worm castings, worm tunnels, and any other biotic activity that you might see. Now, this is very subjective. It may be quite variable throughout a given paddock. Therefore, again, the soil life sub-indicator score does not tabulate to affect the overall score here. But it's just good to note, if we're seeing good soil structure with very little compaction, we're seeing good root structure and vertical development of roots in the profile, then hopefully we're going to see, or we think we should see, visible signs of soil life, like these worms or castings, there's tunnels, etc. So keep that in mind. And again, to really rate this one, you need to take your shovel out there. I know in the past, when it was just compaction that we were looking at, we were able to just take a wire pin flag out with us to the field and test the compaction using that wire pin flag. And that was pretty easy, pretty quick, and effective. But now that we're also looking at root structure development and the soil structure itself as it relates to compaction, it's important you carry that shovel with you. Mike, are there any questions that came in related to this indicator?
I have not seen any questions come in, so let's move forward.
Yes, sir. Plant vigor is the next. All right. Plant vigor, as you know, refers to the health and robustness of a plant compared to other plants of the same species. We're looking for plants that have good color and that regrow quick after a grazing event. Again, you're only going to be there on one day doing this assessment for this round of scoring. Okay, so you're really looking at you're looking for healthy plant color. For plants free of disease, those will be growing rapidly. And typically, it takes good soil fertility, an adjusted pH, adapted forage species, good grazing management, and pretty good growing conditions to result in a vigorous plant canopy in a pasture. Now, if you have to rate plant vigor in the dormant season, you need to use the remaining leaf area that you have left that day that you're out there rating it, combined with all the other indicators of plant health to give it your best estimate of vigor. But really, you should be doing this during the growing season, not during the winter time. Color is the major indicator of a plant's vigor. You need to look right here on the right-hand side. The dark green contrast around these manure piles that are out there, the dark green vegetative cover growing up through those, compared to right adjacent to that, the pale green or yellowish plants in the field in between all those manure pads. This indicates that there's low available nitrogen to those plants in the system, and it's resulting in a reduced vigor because the nitrogen cycle is not really pumping very well. Results in slower recovery after grazing, and will ultimately result in yields that are below site potential if it were otherwise given fertilizer and the nitrogen that it was needed. So it's very important to determine the causative factor that contributes to low plant vigor. All right, what are some factors that can contribute to low plant vigor? Excessive grazing, frequent grazing, low grazing, which is overstocking and severity of use, that can deplete the vigor in plants. When you combine that with low pH and low soil fertility, that can weaken the plants as well. And all of those things contribute to low plant vigor. Moving on to soil erosion indicators. There are 4 different types of erosion that we evaluate on pastures. In Virginia, we typically only see signs of 3 of these, and that includes sheet and rill erosion, stream bank shoreline erosion, and gully erosion. Let's look a little bit closer at these. For sheet and rill erosion, I see this on a lot of pastures. It's not widespread across the pasture landscape itself, but I often find it on side slopes and or toe slopes of heavily grazed pastures. Sheet and rill erosion is caused by direct rainfall impact, drip splash on the bare soil, and a thin sheet of runoff water flowing over the soil surface. It is considered invisible, but the signs of soil loss are evident after a rain event has passed. And you can see right here in the picture on the left of this slide, this is from a farm I was helping assess last, I guess it was this spring. It was over the winter before everything greened up well, but everything had been grazed down. This pasture had been severely used in the past. Most of the perennial desirable species were grazed out of it, so it had to overwinter just with the residue from the summer annuals that naturally had encroached from the previous season and a few winter annuals that had germinated. We get a lot of soil movement, detachment of soil particles and soil movement, and you can see the results of that in the left on the slide. On the right, this close-up shot of another pasture where you can see there's a fair amount of bare soil exposed. You can actually see the debris dams. It's just small particles of residue that form these small dams in between plant bases, typically kind of on the contour of that slope. As they float down and they're detached and they float down and they catch in between these plant bases, it forms these little debris dams. These are indicators of sheet erosion that has taken place in the past. Here you see the typical stream bank and shoreline erosion around creeks and ponds across Virginia. You know, the good thing about addressing these, number one, is if we just exclude the livestock from them, over time, these will become vegetated and fill back in, just a matter of time. But if we exclude the livestock and physically plant vegetation and or trees, then it fills in quickly and revegetates and can have a buffering effect, but it definitely stabilizes the erosion and kind of stops it in its tracks. Gully erosion. This always starts small, but it can have major negative impacts if it's not addressed early. In order to find these gullies when they're small, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to walk the entire pasture system. You cannot pick these up on the aerial photograph necessarily. And you know, I know sometimes it's long days out there walking the overall system. Maybe you want to get back in to finish something off before the end of the day, but please walk the entire pasture system so you can find these problems and they can be incorporated into that conservation plan to address them before they become so large that it restricts movement of machinery across it. And we typically find gullies on continuously grazed pastures and where a lot of our perennial species have been grazed out. And unfortunately, you know, sometimes farmers will feed hay in these gullies. And on one hand, that's good. It helps slow the concentrated runoff. It helps slow the erosion. But at the same time, it concentrates nutrients down this swale, and it gives it a conduit to, when heavy rainfall events come, it washes those nutrients there and conveys them right into the surface water outside the edge of the pasture. Wind erosion. Wind erosion is pretty much non-existent on pasture land in Virginia. And I'll say even on some of the most overgrazed pastures in the state, there's usually enough vegetation, as seen right here in the picture on the right, to keep the soil particles from becoming suspended as they blow across the field. So wind erosion is usually not an issue on pasture land. It's sometimes found on large expanses of open cropland that are conventionally tilled, but usually it's not an issue on pasture land. So, Mike, as I wrap up this, the erosion indicator, are there any questions that have come in on this?
We have a question that did come in. It's a little late on the compaction. Do you have any comments or recommendation for addressing soil compaction on active pastures?
On active pastures, yeah, we need to get to the bottom of what's the causative factor. What caused that compaction? And if it was, and it's oftentimes livestock and or machinery that's driving on or just managed on that land when it's somewhat wet. That's when our pastures are most vulnerable to suffering from direct impacts of compaction. And then it may take several years of good management to overcome that, to get it back to its original condition. But to address it, if we identify the cause, and then we can often, if we're setting up a grazing system anyway, that, you know, managing that herd under high stock densities for short grazing periods in individual paddocks, and then rotating them to provide a long recovery period where those plants can grow out and do their thing and fully grow out before we rotate the cattle back in there again. Over time, that is going to help overcome a lot of compaction, Mike. If there's an area that's just severely compacted, you need to look at and take your penetrometer under good soil moisture conditions to go around that paddock with that penetrometer and try to figure out at what depth is this compaction layer really there. Is it within the top 3 or 4 inches, or is it down below there? And from that point, we can come up with some different things. Sometimes if we graze it down pretty tight in the late summer, let's say in August, you know, you might use a biological remediation method like these daikon style radishes. You might be able to drill in and really try to break through a compacted layer with those roots and tubers if it's up within the top, you know, foot of the soil profile where the compaction really is. Either that or maybe canola. Canola has a good deep taproot. If you graze the pasture down tight in August, you can get, it doesn't take much seed, just a few pounds per acre drilled into that. That might be a really good approach to try to break through some of the compaction that's there. Okay?
Yeah, we have another question that came in.
Yep.
What is your recommendation on operations that are overstocked and don't want to reduce these numbers to follow a prescribed grazing plan? They're basically operating a grazed feedlot, but say they're a grass-based grazing operation.
Yeah. And there's a lot of those across the state. And I think the best that we can possibly do for them is to get them to commit with either the stormwater districts or within our CS to get them to commit to exclude their livestock from their streams and water resources, establish those buffers, and maybe relocate their feeding sites to where it's not causing adjacent resource concerns. Now, by doing those three things, we can have great positive impacts to water quality on that farm, even though it has not achieved any positive impact on the overall pasture condition or performance of those pasture acres. So these farmers who are, like you say, basically running a feedlot on pasture, there's limited things we can do with them. We can help achieve our conservation goals, improve water quality, and things like that, to isolate and contain a lot of the concentrated nutrients, minimize the runoff from those feeding areas, and then spread it back over the pasture land responsibly after that winter. And that might be the best we can do for them. They're not a good fit for trying to force into a prescribed grazing management system. Okay? Good question. Anything else?
Thanks, JB. No, no other questions have come in yet.
Okay. So that's the 10 indicators that you go through and systematically score in this pasture assessment. So what do you do after you complete that? Well, you add those scores up and you're going to get a score. It's typically between 20 and 50 points is where that score is going to come in. In a benchmark situation, it's going to be on the low side. And in a greatly improved situation, several years after managing and implementing the grazing plan and the other conservation practices, it's going to be probably up close to 40 or above. So these PCS indicator scores have many uses. They can be used individually by the indicator or in summary of all 10 of those indicators added together, giving you an overall general score for the pasture. If you're using the individual indicator scores, they can be used to key in on certain aspects of pasture performance. For example, the percent legumes by dry weight. You know, you can just look solely at that and say, hey, what's going on? Why don't we have more legumes in the system? We need to target this. And you need to work that, renovating the pastures with legumes or the 512 forage and biomass planting into that conservation plan. How about percent desirable plants? Maybe we've got a score of a 2 on percent desirable plants. Well, guess what? We can greatly increase the productivity of the pasture if we can change that score 2 with management up to a score 4, right? So first, if there's a lot of undesirable species, you probably have to plan herbaceous weed control. You know, use the appropriate herbicides, working with the extension agent, link them up with the producer to get a herbicide plan in place, address the bad weeds, then schedule in the renovation with the 512 practice to renovate that pasture, plant those desirable species, coupled with management under a 528 prescribed grazing plan. How about plant vigor? Just looking at that individual score of plant vigor, if it's low, you know, you need to have the farmer collect soil samples and have them analyzed and send the copies to you. We need to rule out whether or not it's a factor of low pH or low plant available nutrients. And that's the only way we can really tell, is to get those soil samples. If we have low vigor and it's not a soil fertility or pH problem, then it's all pretty much related probably to the way they've managed the livestock, uncontrolled grazing, high stocking rates, etc. Again, we're getting to the bottom of why are the scores low to start with, and addressing individual actions, or writing certain or assigning certain conservation practices to address it specifically for that specific indicator. Now, if you address some of these things for one indicator, it may have positive effects on 3 or 4 of the different indicators on this sheet, which just works together to compound the positive benefit that you're likely to see if the farmer is willing to implement a full prescribed grazing plan along with the other conservation practices that you plan in the system. So many of our resource concerns and the planning criteria that we have in NRCS are directly linked to individual pasture condition score indicators now. So it's not about the overall score being a 35 or less. As far as addressing specific resource concerns, we're looking at, okay, what's the planning criteria level? And for most of them, it's a 4. We need to, on most of these individual indicators, we need to meet a 4 or 5 to know that we've addressed the resource concern and it's probably no longer a problem. If we have low indicator scores, it should be reviewed carefully, consider how the management changes would need to be addressed to overcome these resource concerns and meet the goals of the operation. Now, if you're looking at the total pasture condition score, that overall rating, it's just a general idea of how well or how poorly the pasture is being managed. But if all you have is that total score of, let's say, 35, then you don't know where the specific weaknesses is in the system until you dig deeper and look at the individual indicators, right? That total score, it's a good overall general comparison from the benchmark condition to compare that each year going forward after some of these conservation practices have been implemented, to be able to track and document the positive progress on the natural resources in the system. All right, now depending on the total scores for each paddock or pasture, there could be minor or major changes in management that are needed. This little table here that I show you on this slide is just some general guidance that if your overall score falls within these different ranges in the left column, then in the right section of this little table are management changes suggested. It's very general, but it applies, okay? And once you have the individual scores and you as the planner are looking at those scores, you can pinpoint, okay, what's the underlying problem? How do we use our conservation practices written into an overall conservation plan and scheduled appropriately over the next 2 to 3 years to overcome this and really achieve the goals that the farmer has in mind for his system and achieve our conservation goals at the same time. You need to be able to write that into the conservation plan, and we need it into the grazing plan narrative. And from that point forward, after the farmer signs that plan and begins implementation, I can't emphasize enough, the conservation is going out once a year, typically this time of year, late September, early October, to do that evaluation. It's a great time. Carry that benchmark pasture condition summary that you can print out, and then go and do the new score and have the farmer with you to learn the process. Or if they're too busy for that, at least make them schedule time to meet with you after you've done that follow-up score to go over the improvements, and then maybe key in on certain indicators that are not improving, figure out why, and get them to recommit to the management that's recommended in their plan to overcome those deficiencies. All right, that kind of concludes today's presentation and training. Mike, are there any final questions that have come in that last little section?
Yes, sir. JB, when will the new pasture conditioning score sheet be integrated into VA Grays?
It is integrated in right now, and we hope to post that and make it available to everyone probably the week after next. Okay? We just went through a major revision of VA Grays. The big part of that revision was updating all the indicator descriptions in Virginia Grays to meet the new pasture condition score sheet. Okay? But at the same time, I worked with our volunteer to upgrade and improve certain other aspects of it to make that tool even more accurate than it already was when we do those projections of the forage livestock balances. So that's coming soon, and we'll make that available, completely available to DCR and any of our partners to be able to use that. Like I said, the revision on it is complete. It's just a matter now of going through the official process of putting it out officially from our state office.
JB, we have another question. Will there be more on-the-ground training with completing the pasture conditioning score sheet for the field offices to make sure we are all completing it the same?
There will be more training. I anxiously await the day when I can meet with you in the field and we can put this into practice without having to worry about any of the COVID-19 restrictions. Hopefully that will be behind us by the spring, and we can put this into practice in the field together, just like we've done before.
Thank you.
Responses, so do we, and thank you for that.
Absolutely. I know we're just over the 2-hour mark. Are there any other wrap-up questions?
There are no other wrap-up questions in the chat box, but we appreciate your time today and your time building up to this presentation and the way you smoothly answered all our questions as we went through today. I'll just remind everybody that we'll be back with you again on October 6th for a grazing plan development talk, and that our session today was recorded. It will be posted on the association's YouTube channel later. And we will work with you to get the PDF document of your PowerPoint slides and have that posted as well for everybody for future readings. And we will provide the list of participants to Carl for CEU collection.